A restaurant owner walked into his own business and sat there for 45 minutes, completely ignored. No service, no water, not even eye contact. But here's what makes it worse. This wasn't a mistake. This is exactly how his staff were trained to treat people. Have you ever sat somewhere and slowly realized nobody was coming back for you? Not in a dramatic way. No one yells. No one insults you. It's quieter than that. It's the kind of silence that makes you question yourself. I remember a moment like that, sitting in a restaurant, watching the server laugh with another table while my glass sat empty. Minutes passed, then more. And I caught myself thinking something I didn't want to admit. Do I just not matter here? Welcome to the channel. This is your channel name. And today I want to walk you through a story that made me sit with that question a little longer than I was comfortable with. Because what if that feeling isn't random? What if it's intentional? I came across the story of a restaurant owner, someone who built his business from nothing, table by table, customer by customer. Let's call him Nathan Mercer. On paper, everything about his company looked perfect. Dozens of locations, strong reviews, growing profits. But something didn't sit right. So one afternoon, he did something most people in his position would never dare to do. He walked into his own restaurant, dressed like someone nobody would notice. Faded jeans, delivery jacket, cap pulled low. And just like that, he disappeared. No recognition, no special treatment, just another face in the room, waiting. What happened next wasn't loud, it wasn't explosive, it was slow, almost invisible. And somehow, that made it worse. If you're curious where this is going, take a second to subscribe. It helps the channel keep telling stories like this, stories that make you see everyday things a little differently. Because what Nathan discovered wasn't just about service. It was about how we decide who deserves to be seen. So he disappeared and decided to just stand there long enough to see what would happen. Nathan didn't rush it. He didn't try to get attention. He just waited. And that's when things started to reveal themselves. Not through words, but through patterns. He approached the host's stand, asked for a table. The hostess glanced at him for half a second, then looked right past him, like her attention had already moved on. No greeting, no warmth. Just a vague gesture toward the waiting area. You can tell a lot from that first interaction. Not what people say, but how quickly they decide who you are. Nathan stepped aside and watched. A few minutes later, a couple walked in. Clean, polished, the kind of presence that naturally draws attention. And just like that, the energy shifted. The same hostess straightened up, her voice lifted. Right this way. No waiting, no hesitation. They were guided past him, to a table that hadn't existed a moment ago. I don't know about you, but that moment hit me harder than anything loud or obvious ever could. Because there's no rule written on the wall that says, we treat people differently. And yet, somehow, everyone seems to understand the system. Nathan stayed quiet. When he was finally seated, it wasn't random. It never is. It was a small table, tucked near the kitchen doors. The kind of place where every swing of the door brings heat, noise, and the constant reminder that you're not meant to stay long. A menu was dropped in front of him. No eye contact, no introduction. Then, nothing. Minutes stretched. Servers moved around him like he was part of the furniture. Some glanced in his direction, then quickly looked away, like acknowledging him would create an obligation they didn't want. Others didn't even do that. And here's the part that stayed with me. It wasn't chaos. It wasn't that the restaurant was failing. Everything was running smoothly, just not for him. A table across the room received drinks before they asked. Their server leaned in, smiling, recommending dishes, remembering details. You could feel the attention, the care. Meanwhile, Nathan sat with an unopened menu and an empty glass. And I kept thinking, how many times have I seen this without really seeing it? Because when you're not the one being ignored, it's easy to miss. Or worse, it feels normal. At one point, a server passed right by his table, close enough to notice, close enough to stop. She didn't, and it wasn't personal. That's what makes it unsettling. It was calculated, not in a cold, intentional way. More like trained behavior. You give your time where it pays off. You move faster where it doesn't. No one says it out loud, but it shows up in every small decision. Nathan waited longer than most people would, not because he had to, but because he needed to understand. At around the 40-minute mark, he finally tried to break the silence. A simple attempt to catch someone's attention as they walked by. "I'll be right with you," she said, already moving. And she never came back. That sentence, I've heard it before. Maybe you have too. It sounds polite, reassuring even, but sometimes it's just a way to move past you without actually stopping. Nathan leaned back slightly, watching the room again. The couple who had been seated immediately after walking in were already halfway through their meal, laughing, relaxed, taken care of. A man who had been waiting before Nathan stood up quietly and left. No scene, no complaint, just a small shake of the head, like he'd seen enough. And that moment felt heavier than anything else, because that's how businesses really lose people. Not through arguments, not through one bad experience, but through quiet exits that no one notices. Nathan could have stood up right then. He could have revealed who he was, demanded answers, changed the entire dynamic in seconds. But he didn't. And I think that's what makes this different. He stayed, not as the owner, not as someone with authority, but as the person most businesses claim to care about and often overlook, a regular customer. And the longer he sat there, the clearer it became. This wasn't about one inattentive server or one bad shift. It had a rhythm to it, a consistency. Certain tables pulled attention like gravity. Others faded into the background. No one needed to explain it. You could feel it. And by the time Nathan finally stood up, not to make a scene, but simply because nothing was going to change, there was already a quiet understanding forming. This wasn't random, and if it wasn't random, then it had to be coming from somewhere. And once you start to feel a pattern, it becomes impossible to ignore it. The next day, Nathan didn't go back to the same place. He chose a different location, different neighborhood, different staff, a fresh environment where in theory everything should have reset. And at first, it almost did. He was greeted, seated without hesitation. A server approached within minutes. Her name was Lily. She smiled, took his order, brought his drink. Everything looked normal. For a moment, I remember thinking, maybe he was wrong. Maybe what happened before really was just a bad day, a bad team, a one-off experience. But then something subtle shifted, not at his table, at another one. A couple walked in, dressed well, carrying the quiet confidence of people used to being taken care of. And Lily changed. It wasn't dramatic, it was almost instinctive. Her posture straightened, her voice softened. She leaned in just a little more, stayed just a little longer. She checked on them twice before Nathan even got his food. And suddenly, everything felt familiar again, because it wasn't about being rude. It was about allocation, time, attention, energy, all of it being distributed differently, depending on who you were. Nathan didn't interrupt. He just watched. A few tables away, an older man sat alone, worn jacket, quiet presence. He raised his hand once. No one came. Not because they didn't see him, but because they chose not to. That's the part people don't like to talk about. We like to believe these things are accidents, oversights. But when it repeats in the same way across different people, it stops feeling accidental. Nathan finished his meal slowly. Not because he was hungry, but because he was thinking. And I think this is where the story shifts. Up until now, it was observation. Now, it became investigation. Because patterns like this don't just appear, they come from somewhere. Later that night, Nathan sat alone, going through internal reports, customer feedback, performance metrics, training materials. The numbers looked perfect. High satisfaction scores, strong reviews, consistent growth. On paper, it was a success story. But something didn't sit right. So he did something most executives never do. He changed one filter. Instead of viewing approved feedback, he opened everything. And that's when the illusion cracked. Dozens of complaints surfaced immediately. People describing the exact same experience he had just lived through. Waiting too long, being ignored, feeling dismissed. Some of them wrote things that, honestly, were hard to read. Not because they were angry, but because they sounded tired, like they had already given up expecting better. Nathan leaned back, and I can imagine that moment clearly. Because it's one thing to feel something personally. It's another to realize it's been happening to hundreds of people. While you were being told everything was fine, he kept digging. And then he found it, a training module. Simple, clean, professional. At first glance, it looked like standard business material, but the language told a different story. It talked about maximizing value per table, identifying high-return customers, optimizing service allocation. It never said ignore certain people. It didn't have to, because the message was already clear. Spend your energy where it pays off, and naturally, pull it away from where it doesn't. I had to pause when I got to this part, because this is where everything changes. This isn't about attitude anymore. It's about instruction. These weren't careless employees. They were following a system designed to reward one type of behavior and quietly discourage another. Nathan kept scrolling, more data, more patterns, and then something else surfaced. Reviews weren't just being overlooked, they were being filtered. Certain keywords, complaints about being ignored, disrespected, were flagged and never made it to the main reports. Lower ratings quietly suppressed. Only the positive experiences floated to the top, which meant the people in charge never had to see the truth, or worse, chose not to. At that point, I stopped thinking about the employees entirely, because how do you blame someone for doing exactly what they were trained to do? The real question shifted. Who created this? And more importantly, who allowed it to continue? Nathan traced the system back through internal structures, management oversight, regional leadership, executive approval, and that's when the final piece clicked into place. This wasn't isolated. It wasn't even local. It was scalable, a strategy, tested in a few locations, expanded where it worked, refined over time. And the worst part? It did work. Revenue was up, efficiency improved. On the surface, everything looked better than ever. But underneath, something far more important was breaking. Not just customer trust, but something inside the people working there. Because when you teach someone to measure others based on perceived value, you don't just change how they work, you change how they see people. And that's the part that stayed with me the most. Because at that point, this wasn't just a business problem anymore. It was a human one. And once Nathan saw that clearly, there was no going back. And once you realize the system itself is the problem, watching it happen one more time hits very differently. Nathan didn't rush to confront anyone. He could have called a meeting, pulled the reports, sent emails that would have shaken the entire company overnight. But he didn't, because there's a difference between knowing something and seeing it one last time with complete clarity. So he went back. Same location, same time of night. The kind of evening where everything is supposed to be at its best. Full tables, warm lighting, the soft hum of conversation. From the outside, it looked like success, and that contrast is what made it harder to watch. Nathan stepped inside quietly. No announcement, no presence, just another customer walking through the door. The wait time was long, understandably so. But even in the chaos, patterns don't disappear. They sharpen. A family walked in ahead of him, casual clothes, kids still carrying the energy of a long day. They were told to wait. Minutes later, another couple arrived. Polished, confident. There was a pause, a quick check, a subtle shift in tone. And somehow, a table opened up. It always just opens up. Nathan didn't react. He simply followed the process, exactly as any other customer would. When his name was called, he was led through the dining room, past tables filled with laughter, plates half finished, glasses being refilled without asking. And then he saw it, the same table, near the kitchen, the place you don't choose, you're assigned. He sat down slowly, not frustrated, not surprised, just aware. Time moved differently when you were paying attention. 5 minutes. No one came. 10 minutes. A server passed by, close enough to notice, far enough to keep going. 15 minutes. Another glance, another quiet decision not to stop. Across the room, everything else felt alive. Conversations flowing. Servers leaning in. Small moments of connection happening at every table that mattered. But here, nothing. And I think that's the part that's hardest to explain. It's not just about being ignored. It's about watching care, being given freely, just not to you. Nathan sat with that, not as the owner, but as someone who had built a business on the belief that every person walking through the door deserved the same experience. At some point, the waiting stopped being the issue. The clarity became the issue. Because now, there was no doubt. This wasn't inconsistency. This was design, playing out exactly as intended. When his food finally arrived, it was quick, efficient, set down without a word, no follow-up, no check-in, just another transaction, completed. Nathan took a bite, paused, and looked around the room one more time. A young mother trying to get someone's attention while managing a restless child. An older couple sitting quietly, their empty glasses pushed slightly forward, hoping someone would notice. And across the room, a group celebrating, fully engaged, fully served. The contrast was almost uncomfortable to witness. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was normal. That's when something shifted, not in the room, in him. He set his fork down, not abruptly, not to make a point, just deliberately. Then he stood up. There's something about that moment. When someone who has been silent the entire time finally decides to speak, it changes the air. Nathan walked toward the center of the dining room, not fast, not slow, just steady. And then he stopped. "Can I speak to the manager?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried, because silence has a way of amplifying certain moments. The manager approached with the kind of confidence that comes from believing everything is under control. A practiced smile, a calm tone. "Is there a problem?" Nathan looked at him, and for a second, nothing happened. Then he spoke, not with anger, but with precision. He described what had happened, not just that night, but over the past several days. The waiting, the lack of attention, the consistent difference in how people were treated. You could feel the room shifting, not because people fully understood yet, but because something real was being said. The manager tried to respond, apologize, smooth it over. But Nathan didn't stop him with volume. He stopped him with truth. And then he did something simple. He reached up and removed his cap. There was no dramatic pause, no performance, just a quiet reveal. And in that moment, everything changed. The posture, the expressions, the understanding of who had been standing there the entire time. I've thought about that moment more than once, not because of the shock, but because of what it represents, how quickly perception shifts when identity is revealed, how the same person in the same place becomes someone entirely different the moment you assign them value. The room didn't erupt, it didn't need to, because the realization was already there, hanging in the air, unavoidable. And I think that's what makes this moment so powerful. It wasn't about catching someone doing something wrong. It was about holding up a mirror to a system that had been working exactly as designed, and finally, forcing it to see itself. And once the truth is seen that clearly, you don't get to walk away from it unchanged. What happened next wasn't loud. There were no dramatic speeches, no public spectacle meant to save face, just decisions. Quiet, irreversible decisions. The kind that don't try to protect the system, but instead start taking it apart piece by piece. Nathan didn't just address what happened in that room. He went after everything that allowed it to happen. The training programs were pulled, not revised, removed. The filters that buried customer complaints were dismantled. Every review, good or bad, was brought back into the light. Managers who had enforced those priorities were no longer in those positions. And the people at the top, the ones who approved it, who saw the numbers and chose not to ask deeper questions, they were held accountable too. Not out of anger, but out of responsibility. Because if a system teaches people to see others as less valuable, that responsibility doesn't sit at the bottom, it starts at the top. And I think that's something a lot of people overlook. We're quick to blame behavior without asking what shaped it. We point at the server who didn't come back to the table, but we rarely ask what kind of pressure they were under, what expectations were placed on them, what they were quietly being measured against. Nathan understood that, which is why what he changed went beyond surface-level fixes. He rebuilt the standard. Not just serve faster, not just increase revenue, but something much simpler and much harder to maintain. Treat every person who walks through the door like they matter, not because of what they spend, not because of how they look, but because they showed up. And that sounds obvious, almost too simple to say out loud. But if it were truly that simple, stories like this wouldn't exist. In the weeks that followed, something interesting happened. Business didn't skyrocket overnight. In fact, it dipped. Some investors questioned the decisions. Some metrics didn't look as strong as before. Because when you stop optimizing purely for profit, things get messy. You spend more time on people who may not spend as much. You slow down processes that were designed for efficiency. And for a while, it looks like you're losing. But then something else starts to take shape. Customers begin to return, not just for the food, but for how they feel when they're there. Reviews become more honest, more balanced, not artificially perfect, but real. And over time, that trust becomes something numbers alone can't replicate. Employees start to change too. When you remove the pressure to judge, you give people space to care again, to connect, to notice, to stop seeing a table as a number and start seeing it as a person. I keep thinking about that part because earlier in the story, there was someone who stood out, a server who didn't fully agree with what she was being told to do, who felt that quiet discomfort of knowing something wasn't right. People like that exist in every system. They're just waiting for permission to do the right thing. And when the system changes, they're the first ones to bring it back to life. A few months later, Nathan walked into one of his restaurants again. This time, not in disguise, no cap, no jacket, no need to hide. And something was different. Not perfect, but different. He was greeted, not because of who he was, but because that's what had become normal again. He sat down at a table by the window, not the best seat because he owned the place, but because someone decided that was the right way to treat a guest. And I imagine that moment felt quieter than everything that came before it. No confrontation, no realization, just a sense of alignment, like something that had been pulled out of place was finally set back where it belonged. But if I'm being honest, the part that stayed with me the most wasn't the transformation of the business. It was what it revealed about us. Because it's easy to point at a company and say, that's wrong. It's harder to look at ourselves and ask where we've done something similar. Not intentionally, but subtly. The way we give more attention to certain people based on what we think they can offer us. The way we move quicker or slower depending on who's in front of us. We all like to believe we're fair, that we treat people equally. But fairness isn't something you claim. It's something you practice in small, unnoticed moments. Moments where there's no reward, no recognition, just a choice. So the next time you walk into a place, pay attention. Not just to whether you're treated well, but to who isn't. Look at the person sitting quietly in the corner, the one waiting a little too long, the one no one seems to notice. Because sometimes the clearest way to understand a system is to see who it forgets. And maybe, if enough of us start noticing that, we won't need someone to stand in the middle of the room just to remind us what should have been obvious all along. When I sit back and think about this story as a whole, it doesn't really feel like a story about a restaurant anymore. It feels like a quiet reflection of how easily we drift into valuing people based on what we think they can give us instead of who they are. What made this powerful wasn't the reveal or even the consequences. It was the realization that none of this required bad intentions to happen. It only required small, repeated decisions made without awareness. And over time, those decisions turned into a system, a culture, a normal way of treating people that no one questioned anymore. The deeper lesson here is simple, but not easy. Respect should never be conditional. In everyday life, that means slowing down just enough to notice people who are often overlooked. It means giving the same attention, the same patience, the same basic kindness, even when there's nothing to gain from it. Because the real test of character isn't how we treat important people, it's how we treat invisible ones. So here's something I'd genuinely like to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a moment where you felt invisible like this, or witnessed it happen to someone else? If you're comfortable, share your story in the comments. Your perspective might help someone else see things differently. And if this story made you think even a little deeper today, consider subscribing to support the channel so we can keep exploring more stories that actually matter.